Hi, everyone. I wanted to give you a brief introduction to this week's topic, and we're going to begin talking about what can be referred to as social process theories. A few weeks ago, we looked at strain theory and social disorganization theory, and to many criminological theorists, those theories, strain and social disorganization, are referred to as social structural theories. Some of the earliest versions of those theories looked at how different groups of people live in different structures within society. So really that boils down to, are we thinking about how lower classes are different from upper classes and how being in a different class might contribute to criminal behavior? For this week, we're talking about social process theories, and these examine the social characteristics that are related to processes that might allow criminal behavior to develop. So we have to think about how a social process is the cause for crime. And we have two versions of social process theories to consider, one being differential association and social learning theory, kind of an evolutionary track there, whether we talk about the older version, differential association, or the newer version, social learning theory, and social control theories. I want to emphasize there that social control theories is plural because there are multiple versions of social control theories that we can explore. But the first one that comes up in our reading is the learning theories. And what I want you to do is, before you even get into the criminological literature, think about how we learn. What is the process of learning? And in the Vold book, the authors point to the Aristotelian thought of association. We learn by identifying association. So one thing is related to another, and we associate those two things together, and that is a process of learning. But psychologically speaking, there are many different types of learning or different sorts of strategies or tactics that are involved in learning. And for those of you who have had an introductory psychology class along the way, you will probably be familiar with some of these things, like the research done by Pavlov with making his dog salivate, or Skinner and the research that he did on rats and operant conditioning, and even Bandura's social learning processes. And that's where we get the criminological theory of social learning, which is a derivative of, or a descendant of, differential association theory. The theory changes in name, changes in principles, but it's essentially the same historical trajectory of using learning to understand how people come to criminal behavior. So there's a theory there. And if we don't think about the ancient Greek philosophers or other things that have happened into the 1700s and 1800s, differential association theory begins with the theoretical writings of Edwin Sutherland. Edwin Sutherland didn't begin to think about how to write a theory. He was really just tasked with the idea of writing an introductory textbook to the criminology classes that he was teaching. And in the first two editions of this book, it was just like any other textbook. He wrote about the police, he wrote about parole and probation, he wrote about these criminal justice responses to crime, and summarized some of the leading theories of criminal behavior at the time. As he got into it, his ideas were pronounced. And in the third edition of this textbook, Principles of Criminology, he proposed a theory of differential association. And this theory is largely stable out of respect for Sutherland. His predecessor, his student, Donald Cressy, picked up the editing of this textbook after Sutherland's death. But out of respect, he didn't really change much to it. He preserved it. So in the third edition of this book, 1939, Sutherland lays out 9 propositions for differential association. I want you to look at those. They are summarized or briefly stated in our textbook, but in other sources, they're written more completely. And certainly in Sutherland's book, they're written out as fully as possible, as fully as Sutherland. But I want you to look at each one. And they show the process of learning through social relationships. Number 1 is really important. Well, they're all very important, but number 1 is simply stated and very important for a specific reason. Number 1 says criminal behavior is learned. I want you to think about that and contrast that with some of the other sentiments from theories that might compete with Sutherland. 1939, when he proposed this, was right around the time when biological theories were still dominant. And what he was saying here is that 50 years prior to his theory, the evidence from Lombroso might be wrong. 1939 was important because we've got the development of eugenics movements and the idea through controlling the population's reproductive abilities, we might be able to have a better class of people. Sutherland is saying it's not about biology. He's saying criminal behavior is learned. It's simple, it's straightforward. To some extent, it's elegant that we think about learning processes as opposed to genetic information or being born into criminality. That's pretty important, but all 9 of those statements are important. And in the end, I want to point out there's something that's at least curious to me, or makes me curious about the sentiments of the author as he was writing this. He takes a little jab at strain theory. If you look at the history of strain theory, Merton wrote strain theory in 1938. So 1939, we can assume Sutherland is very aware of strain theory. And here he starts to talk about crime needs and values. And it's not so much that poverty drives crime, something that we might get from Merton's strain theory, but that we decide to react to poverty with crime because of what we've learned, what we value. So those are fighting words in a criminological sense. And that's pretty interesting to witness, to observe, to understand. Here we have the genuine sentiment of the author and his surroundings and how important it is to address his own thoughts in comparison to the predecessors, the theorists that came before him or were contemporary to him. Social learning theory comes from this. Sutherland dies in the mid-20th century, and we would think that theory would die with him. But Ron Akers took it, turned differential association theory into social learning theory. It's really a theory about social psychology at this point. What Akers did to Sutherland's theory is take the idea of learning and then express more completely what those learning processes were with psychological language. So we read more specifically about which concepts, which constructs, which aspects of learning could contribute to delinquent behavior and criminality. Lots of research has been done on social learning theory. Ron Akers continues to write about social learning theory. If you read through his summary textbook, you'll see him compare social learning theory, as he has worked on it for 40 or 50 years, in comparison to all the other theories. And he clearly thinks social learning is a more dynamic theory and a dominant theory for explaining criminal. It's interesting to see how the roots of it start with this contrast to biological theory, and how Ron Akers has turned it into a psychological theory of learning processes in social settings. Another offshoot to this is kind of hard to categorize, but represents cultural deviance. It's not so much that people learn to be antisocial or disrespect the rules for the dominant culture, but cultural deviance suggests that people learn different rules about behavior. And we see a couple of examples of this in the readings selected for this week, including The Code of the Street, written by Elijah Anderson, about life in Philadelphia. And we can extend that to other cultural settings or non-dominant cultural settings where different rules for behavior dictate what we do or how we act. The second theory that we have to discuss this week is control theory. And control theory is another one that has a broad history to it. There are multiple versions of control theory. And what we have to do is think about what it takes to make us controlled. If we believe that we are social creatures and something causes us to be bad, that's something we can pursue with other theories. But control theory has this other separate basic assumption that in our hearts, in our minds, in our core, we are self-interested. And there's something that comes to us that controls that self-interest. In the absence of something to control us, that self-interest will drive us to social behavior or criminal behavior, delinquent behavior. There are multiple versions of this. Many of you who have had an undergraduate class in criminological theory will think about Travis Hershey's version of social control theory, frequently referred to as social bonding theory, or in some circles, just boiled down to attachment theory, where we think about the social relationships that we have and how they control our behavior. There are multiple theorists that have contributed to this control theory domain. There are multiple versions of this. And if you think about when they are presented, whether it's the 1940s or 50s or 60s or even later, the variables, the concepts, the constructs that become important to the theory are related to the social times. So in the 1950s, we have F. Ivan Nye present a theory about direct and indirect parental controls. Well, that's a time period in American history where parents were seen as very influential to the upbringing of their children. Hershey's version of the theory comes out in 1969, and he criticizes all previous versions of control theory as well as every other social theory that existed at the time. Some people present him as a cranky old man, and to some extent he is, but really what he is confident that his idea might be superior to the other ideas. And he goes about it in a sort of methodical way in his book by comparing and contrasting his version of control theory to all other theories that are out there, and showing why it's superior. In his book, one of the things that made it really popular at the time and still today is the elegance of it, the simplicity of it. He boils down our social relationships to 4 different components that control our behavior: attachment, commitment to pro-social activities, involvement in pro-social activities, and moral beliefs. Today, we understand that the most dominant aspect of the theory is attachment to pro-social people. Generally, for younger people, that's going to be their parents, but we can insert in there the likelihood that there are pseudo-parents. This could be a neighbor, an uncle, a valuable teacher, or a coach. These people can provide pro-social relationships, and through an emotional bond or attachment, that might control our interest in being deviant or delinquent. So please read through all that and try to see how elegant that theory was. One of the things that I put into the PowerPoint was that because Hershey embraced the idea of self-reported data, he told everybody how to measure these concepts with survey instruments. And that led a lot of subsequent sociologists and criminologists to test his theory because it was so easy. It was easy to reproduce a survey, administer it to a class of students, and find that people with emotional attachments to their parents or friends or other pro-social individuals, people who were committed to pro-social activities like school or work, engaged in crime and delinquency with lesser frequencies. There was always positive results there. It's a simple and straightforward theory, but it led to a lot of tests of the theory. And just because there were a lot of tests doesn't necessarily mean it was a stronger theory, but it certainly was evidence that it was a very popular theory. Today, we have a different version of control theory that Travis Hershey and Michael Govertson presented, where they say self-control is actually the most important control. And we're going to be introduced to that a little bit in the readings this week, but I want to hold off some discussion of that until we get to the end of the semester, where we discuss developmental criminology. Developmental criminology is a great opportunity for us to compare and contrast that theory of self-control with other theories that explain crime over the life course. The only other thing that I wanted to point out this week is to have you keep in mind that Durkheim might have been a control theorist. Now, a lot of times we see the direct relationship between Durkheim and Merton's strain theory because Durkheim wrote about anomie and Merton wrote about anomie, but Durkheim was writing about normlessness as anomie. And Merton kind of used that phrase and gave it a different definition by saying anomie was this disjunction between instincts and the availability of appropriate means to achieve those goals. Durkheim was really talking about norms and how norms control behavior. He was a control theorist. And if we think about how normative behavior comes out of social relationships, we can draw a more direct connection between Durkheim and some of these control theorists that were popular in the mid to late part of the 20th century. I hope you enjoy the readings this week. If you have any questions about anything, please let me know. I'm available by email. You can give me a call, or we can set up a time to meet by video conference. I hope you're enjoying the class. I enjoy reading about your thoughts, and I hope you enjoy the social process theories, differential association and social learning theory, or differential reinforcement theory, depending on which label you put on it. It's an interesting theory, and it explains a lot about crime and delinquency, and social control theories. Depending on which version you appreciate the most, we see the social relationships that are related to crime and delinquency. Thanks again, and I hope to hear from you soon.